Welcome everyone to Stanford University and the Center for International Security and Cooperation. We appreciate you joining us for our weekly research seminar. This week, my name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Interim Social Science Co-Director at CSAC. I'll be hosting today's seminar where we're welcoming Michelle Spector from MIT. Michelle is one of our CSAC pre-doctoral fellows and also a pre-doctoral fellow at Stanford's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute. She is a PhD candidate at MIT in History, Anthropology, and Science, Technology, and Society. Her research focuses on the ways that national biometric identification systems shape state-citizen relationships and how past biometric infrastructures influence contemporary ones. Today, she'll be speaking to us on part of her dissertation research, and her talk is entitled Quantifying the National Physique, Deterioration, Degeneracy, and the British National Anthropometric Survey of 1904. Before I turn it over to Michelle Spector, just a quick reminder, there'll be some time for Q&A at the end of the talk. As a webinar format, you can enter those questions in the Q&A function of Zoom at any time. So please feel free to do so we can queue up some questions for the end of Michelle's talk. So without much further ado, Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Harold, for the introduction, and to everyone at CSAC for giving me the opportunity to share a small snapshot of work in progress that I have going as part of my fellowship at CSAC and HI this year. And today, I'm going to speak about an example from technological history, specifically a national biometric system that the British government almost, but ultimately never implemented almost 120 years ago. And I'll consider the insights that it can provide for understanding the social and political dimensions of biometric systems today. Biometrics, those quantified and today usually digitized measurements of fingerprints, faces, and other parts of the body, are much older than they seem. Having been around since at least the 19th century, they formed the quantitative basis of eugenics research. They've been used by colonial powers to identify their subjects, by police to track and identify criminals, as well as by governments to track allegedly suspicious groups and marginalized communities. In recent decades, though, states have increasingly started using biometrics to identify their own citizens. And it is these kinds of systems, national biometric identification systems, that are the subject of my talk today. So many states around the world have national identification systems, and a very high number of them have electronic systems, many of which incorporate biometrics in some way. They cite a number of justifications for these systems, ranging from government efficiency, the delivery of services and benefits, the prevention of identity theft, national security, among other reasons. And most of these systems follow the same basic premise of using measurements of part of the body, like a fingerprint, in order to verify citizens' identities. And this can happen in two forms, through one-to-one identification, where data from the body, like a fingerprint, is matched to data that is stored on a card, or one-to-many identification, where data taken from the body is compared to a set of data that is stored within a database. So in order to understand states' interests in using biometrics to identify their own citizens, I propose that we travel back in time to London on April 2nd, 1903. On that date, the United Kingdom's War Office published a memorandum stating that a very large proportion of the men who offer themselves for enlistment in the army are found to be physically unfit for military service. The Director General of the Army Medical Service, Sir William Taylor, who wrote the memorandum, went on to say that the want of physique, thus shown to exist with regard to a large section of the community, is not only serious from its military aspect, it is serious also from its civil standpoint. For if these men are unfit for military service, what are they good for? His memo included statistics on the number of recruits who were rejected upon medical inspection, and that this was due to a variety of matters related to physical health and fitness. And then most shockingly, the report stated that up to 60%, or at least this is what it speculated, that up to 60% of potential recruits were physically unfit for military service. This pronouncement alarmed London policymakers as it heightened already existing fears about national decline, and that specifically that there was an ongoing decline in the national physique. So to investigate this issue, the Lord President of the Privy Council convened an Inter-departmental Committee on Physical Deterioration the following September of that same year. The committee comprised of 8 men, most of whom worked in education across the UK, a member of the Marine Recruiting Office, and a physician from the General Registrar Office. And the committee had 3 goals: to acquire data that would estimate the health and physique of the people, to identify the causes of physical deterioration, if it is actually occurring, and to figure out the ways in which this deterioration could be diminished. They collected evidence from 64 witnesses, including physicians, representatives of government, public institutions, and charitable organizations. And these witnesses addressed a number of factors that they thought implicated potential physical deterioration in the population, which included population growth, working conditions, birth rates, alcoholism, syphilis, dental caries, urban living conditions, malnourishment among children, and poor ventilation in schools and factories, among other factors. And in addition to these witnesses, the Inter-departmental Committee also invited 2 anthropologists from the British Association for the Advancement of Science, or the BAAS for short. Daniel Cunningham, who's a professor of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and a government clerk and amateur anthropologist named John Gray. And at the time, Gray and Cunningham were both leading an anthropometric committee that had been founded at the BAAS in 1902. And they provided testimonies to the Inter-departmental Committee on Anthropometry, techniques of biometrically measuring the human body, and how it could be used to measure the national physique and detect physical deterioration. Based on their advice, the Inter-departmental Committee's final report recommended a National Anthropometric Survey, a large-scale collection and investigation of biometric measurements of British citizens' bodies, in order to determine whether physical deterioration was occurring. So how did this emerge as the sort of chosen tool for measuring the national physique in this context? To answer this question, I'll show how the survey's design and methods were shaped by the different aims held by the Anthropometric Committee, as represented by Gray and Cunningham, and the Inter-departmental Committee. The Inter-departmental Committee hoped to use the survey to measure the health of the people and to create social reforms that would improve the living and working conditions of sectors of society that they feared were physically deteriorating, primarily the urban working class. On the other hand, the Anthropometric Committee saw the survey as an opportunity to pursue their eugenics research on racial classification in the UK, and to publicize their support for anti-immigration policies that would exclude Eastern European Jewish immigrants, who they alleged were causing degeneracy in the population. Ultimately, the survey was never implemented, but both of these groups influenced its organization and methods, even the very minute details of the measurements that would be used to measure the national physique. They also imbued the survey with contrasting explanations for physique itself. The Inter-departmental Committee largely subscribed to an environmental approach to this question, which explained human attributes as products of circumstances and where environmentally caused deterioration could be reversed. In contrast, the Anthropometric Committee mostly subscribed to a hereditarian view of physique, where inherited degeneration was fixed and irreversible. These contrasting views, which influenced the survey's design, also implicated contrasting politics of national inclusion and exclusion. As a tool of governance, the survey reflected the Inter-departmental Committee, specifically policymakers' desires to improve the national physique by including a marginalized population, the urban working class, into the national whole through policy reforms. but it also at the same time reflected eugenic desires to classify the nation as a set of inferior and superior races and to exclude Jewish immigrants in particular. Now, before I go on, I do want to address a question that maybe at least some of you are thinking, which is, what does any of this actually have to do with biometric systems today? And what is there to learn from a technological system from nearly 120 years ago that in the end never even actually happened? Well, even unsuccessful technological infrastructures contain insights into the social and political contexts of their time. Studying systems that were not implemented and why can lend insights into the problems they were meant to solve, the priorities that guided their design, and the attitudes that people had toward them. And in this way, the National Anthropometric Survey provides context for analyzing states' uses of biometrics today, especially in cases where they use them to identify their own citizens. It brings our attention to the possibility that states haven't turned to biometric technologies just because of the belief that they're the most efficient or accurate or novel techniques out there. In fact, biometrics were just as cutting edge in 1904 as they are now. So the survey shows that interest in using them stemmed from a variety of social and political concerns and not just technical concerns. Now, the survey was not a direct ancestor of any biometric systems that exist today. That said, I suggest that it was still an important precursor of contemporary systems and an important and informative event in the history of states' interests in using them to identify their own citizens. The survey shows how national biometric systems link measurements of citizens' bodies with notions of national belonging, a link that can underwrite the exercises of state power that these systems afford, and is also part of what can make them legitimate or illegitimate to policymakers, to the public. The survey was not simply a tool for collecting citizen data. It was also a tool for intervening in tensions over industrialization, urbanization, immigration, class, race, and empire, dynamics that endure in biometric systems today. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll first review some themes, insights, and kind of general literatures that this work is so far as I'm working on it, that I'm engaging with. I'm not going to do a whole lot of name dropping here, but if anyone's curious, I'd be happy to send along some sources that I've been working with if you email me. I'll also review the materials that I use to conduct this empirical analysis. Then I'll share some background on the Inter-departmental and the Anthropometric committees and how they converged over their interest in a National Anthropometric Survey. And in particular, I'll show how both of these groups infuse the survey's design and actual technical methods with varying conceptions of national belonging, how this related to their hereditarian and environmental approaches to physique and politics of national inclusion and exclusion that came along with it. In the epilogue, I'll explain what happened in the end and offer some ideas as to why the survey failed. And then in the conclusion, I'll share a few thoughts about how this work might be able to inform our thinking about contemporary systems. The 1904 survey so far has mostly been addressed by scholarship in the history of eugenics, medicine, public health, and anthropology, and I draw heavily upon their insights into the survey's social, political, and scientific contexts at the turn of the century UK. But I also place the survey as a key event in the history of biometric identification and states' interests in using biometrics to identify their own citizens. So this offers a kind of challenge to common conceptions of the use of biometrics, as a shift from the use of biometrics from identifying marginalized populations toward whole populations as something that only happened very recently. In fact, this is something that was maybe on the table for a lot longer than people think. From there, my claim that the survey was a technological and a political project draws upon science and technology studies and related literatures that look at how states use technologies to make their own citizens legible and how national politics and technological systems influence one another. Considering the survey as a precursor of contemporary biometric systems also foregrounds the bio part of biometrics. It brings attention to the social and political stakes of technologies that use measurements of the body to make inferences about individual identity. And to that end, this work joins scholarship that seeks to disambiguate the seeming objectivity and neutrality of biometric data, including work that highlights the discriminatory dimensions of biometric systems and how biases related to race, age, gender, and disability, for example, can be built into biometric technologies themselves. This work also joins a broader set of research that emphasizes biometrics' transnational origins in eugenics, colonialism, and policing. And these are histories that often remain unexamined in contemporary analyses of biometric technologies. And in this way, this work could be informative to the large body of work that looks at the relationship between national security and biometric systems today. National security as a word, as a concept, as a justification did not appear in connection to the 1904 survey, but that does not mean that this system is conceptually or technologically distinct or separate from contemporary biometric systems, especially those related to security in some way. So contextualizing these contemporary systems within this longer history shows how they can contain politics of national exclusion and inclusion. My empirical analysis is based on archival research that I conducted during 2019 and 2020. I mainly rely on the final report of the Inter-departmental Committee published in 1904, as well as reports from the British Association for Advancement of Science conferences that took place around the same period. These have all been digitized and made available online by the Wellcome Collection, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Royal Anthropological Institute, and some other institutions. In addition to these sources, I also use materials from the British Association for Advancement of Science archives, which are held by the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. And I owe a lot of thanks to the archivists there who made sure that I could see these materials before they were taken away for a really long time for a digitization project. And in addition to all this, I also consulted Hansard, the online repository of British parliamentary proceedings, and materials from the Labour History Archives in Manchester. The War Office's revelation in 1903 about the physical fitness of military recruits and its speculations and subsequent speculations about physical deterioration in the population augmented already existing fears that the British Empire and the health and well-being of the British people were in decline. The empire had just come out of the Second Boer War, and although in that war they consolidated their control over South Africa, it exposed dysfunctions in the military administration and government overall. A weakening agricultural sector spurred people to relocate from rural areas to cities, and then poverty increased in urban areas at this time as well. Compulsory education meant that children spent many hours a day in poorly ventilated spaces, and more people, men and women and children, were working in cramped factories. The British Empire's commercial strength was waning. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and this was soon followed by the resignation of the Prime Minister in 1902. Reckonings with widely held but unrealistic conceptions of the countries of the UK as ethnically homogenous were put into the spotlight by an ongoing wave of immigration of Eastern European Jews. This fueled concerns about national decline, which were then further augmented by the emigration of young men to current and former British colonies at that time, especially from Ireland, as well as a decreasing and differential birth rate across social classes. In the backdrop of all of these developments, the War Office's findings propelled the Privy Council to convene the Inter-departmental Committee to investigate physical deterioration in the population. Comprised mostly of policymakers from the education sector, they joined a widely held tendency among health authorities and policymakers at that time to take an environmental approach to human physique. They viewed physical deterioration as an environmentally caused condition that could be corrected through better diet, cleaner air, less crowding, more exercise, and medical care. And their interest in a National Anthropometric Survey was supported by an increasing belief among British policymakers that quantitative methods in population statistics could be useful policymaking tools, as well as a growing interest in public health and physical fitness at the time. In support of the National Anthropometric Survey, the final report claimed that it was admitted on all hands that anthropometric records were the only accredited tests available, and that if collected on a sufficient scale, they would constitute the supreme criterion of physical deterioration or the reverse. Physical deterioration at that time was also of great concern to the eugenics movement and the British anthropologists, statisticians, and other researchers who worked in this field. The term eugenics was coined by the British anthropologist and cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, in the late 19th century, and he described it as the science of improving human stock by giving the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Anthropometry and biometry, quantitative techniques of measuring the human body, as well as their mental attributes, emerged as the evidential backbone of eugenics during the 19th century's second half. Eugenics researchers like Galton, the statistician Carl Pearson, and more importantly to the story here, members of the BAAS committee like John Gray and Daniel Cunningham used anthropometrics to research human heredity and population characteristics. They published their findings in journals, presented their research at conferences like the BAAS annual meeting, and were in pretty regular contact with other anthropometric researchers across Europe and in North America. Gray and Cunningham and the Anthropometric Committee were more likely to take a hereditarian view of human physique. They tended to explain physical deterioration as an inherited and irreversible degeneration of what they called the national race. So for them, this term, the national race, linked together notions of race, class, ethnicity, empire, social attributes, language, familial genealogies, as well as nationality and local and regional origins. And the Anthropometric Committee, like other turn of the century British eugenicists, were extremely preoccupied with the origins and composition of what they called the United Kingdom's four great stocks: the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. In this way, their idea of a British national physique posited a racialized and very fixed national past and future whose origins and characteristics could be demonstrated through a national anthropometric survey, or so they believed. Their interests in conducting an anthropometric study of all of the inhabitants of the UK also actually predated the creation of the Inter-departmental Committee by about 2 years. At the 1902 BAAS meeting in Belfast, the association's anthropology section convened it in order to organize anthropometric investigation in Great Britain and Ireland. And they granted it a £5 budget, which would be worth over £600 today. During the following year, the newly formed committee took upon itself to standardize and optimize anthropometric methods. And they decided that the best way to do that would be to create a central bureau. The bureau would provide training in anthropometric measurement, disseminate information about the fields, and establish standards. And they envisioned that it would be a national authority on anthropometry that would support research on race, class, and the attributes of people in different parts of the country. And they anticipated that the statistics would, in the course of time, form very valuable material for determining the physical characteristics of the British people. Now, when the Inter-departmental Committee heard about the ongoing work at the BAAS, they invited Daniel Cunningham, the chair at the time of the Anthropometric Committee, and John Gray, the committee's secretary, to provide scientific opinions on physical deterioration and on anthropometry. The two of them submitted a proposal for a national anthropometric survey that was largely based on their existing plans for a central bureau. They also provided oral testimonies to the Inter-departmental Committee. And these two groups' convergence on anthropometrically measuring the British population was a fortuitous coincidence for both of them. The Inter-departmental Committee needed expertise in anthropometric measurements, and Gray and Cunningham basically were presented with an opportunity to actualize a research project that for them had only been aspirational up until that point. Nevertheless, Gray and Cunningham's aims for the survey were guided by the eugenic priorities of their own research. Their testimonies influenced the Inter-departmental Committee's recommendations by presenting physical deterioration as simultaneously caused by environmental and inherited factors, and by making sure to recommend anthropometric measurements that would suit both their aims and the state's aims. So the BAAS actually already had a little bit of experience with conducting nationwide anthropometric investigations. In 1875, a prior anthropometric committee at the BAAS, headed by Francis Galton, carried out a survey of the British population's heights, weights, and health and pigmentation observations between 1877 and 1883. Though Cunningham and Gray and the Inter-departmental Committee mostly regarded this survey as very incomplete, as less than 9,000 adults had participated by the time it wrapped up. This prior survey was the largest collection of anthropometric measurements that they had at their disposal, both as a source of prior data to draw upon, but also, as the historian Elise Smith has pointed out, as a source of legitimacy for conducting another one. And what made this survey particularly interesting to the Interdepartmental Committee was that, contrary to the hereditarian views prevalent in anthropology at the time, and especially those held by eugenic luminaries on that prior anthropometric committee itself, like Francis Galton, the report found that environmental factors, and particularly employment and economic categories, most strongly correlated with anthropometric difference. So for example, the study concluded that agricultural laborers were taller and therefore had better physique than factory workers. And these findings seem to confirm the environmental assertions about the effects of urban living and working conditions on the human body, which is what the Interdepartmental Committee really wanted to learn more about. Now, Gray and Cunningham, in their testimonies to the Interdepartmental Committee, did not deny these findings. And they affirmed that things like a lack of fresh air or malnutrition, disease could cause physical deterioration. But they couched this acknowledgement within the hereditarian orientations of their own anthropometric research. Drawing on prior studies by Flinders Petrie in Egypt and other anthropological research on anthropometric measurements of the inhabitants of British colonial territories, Cunningham and Gray also told the Interdepartmental Committee that physical features remain constant in racial groups. So in this framework, they understood physical deterioration as a negative deviation from what they called the mean physical standard of a particular race, which could be measured through anthropometry. The whole value of anthropometric statistics as a test of physical deterioration, and this is what Gray said to the committee, depends upon the constancy of physical dimensions under normal conditions. He also asserted that any change, any large decrease from the mean physical standard over a short period of time would indicate, as he said, that some of normal force is at work, which is bringing about this change in the dimensions. Now, in their testimonies, Cunningham and Gray scaled up the concept of mean physical standards to the nation as a whole. According to them, there was a mean physical standard of the entire population of the UK, which the National Anthropometric Survey could reveal. And by carrying out the survey continuously over time, it could detect physical deterioration by quantifying any future deviations from this standard. It could also pinpoint whether any groups deviated from it more than others. So when it was understood as deviations from this mean, physical deterioration could then be determined and addressed through targeted policies. The Interdepartmental Committee adopted this line of thinking, in which an environmental approach to physical deterioration was entangled with, and in fact actually depended on, the acceptance of a hereditarian view of a mean physical standard of a so-called national race. So by framing the survey in this way, Gray and Cunningham ensured that it would serve the Interdepartmental Committee's interest in measuring the health of the people, as well as their own eugenic interests in studying the racial composition of the population. This entanglement of hereditarian and environmental approaches also shaped the methods of the survey and its organization. Gray and Cunningham's memorandum to the Interdepartmental Committee proposed that the survey be organized as follows. It would have a consultative committee of 3 anthropologists from Scotland, Ireland, and England who would determine the survey's measurements and instruments. There would be a London-based central bureau, which would include a statistical department. They would train anthropometric surveyors and collect and analyze data. And then, of course, there are the surveyors or measurers themselves, men and women who would go and collect measurements across the UK. The survey also would divide the population of approximately 41.5 million people into 400 districts of 100,000 individuals. And it would measure a representative sample from each one, a representative sample of adults from each one, to total 800,000 altogether. And then they would also measure all primary school children, numbering about 8 million. They estimated that it would take about 10 years to measure all of these people, at which point a sort of anthropometric snapshot of the nation would be obtained, and then the process would start all over again so that future data could be compared with past data. Gray and Cunningham also proposed a set of anthropometric measurements, all of which were accepted by the Inter-departmental Committee. According to them, the most important measure was stature or height. They also argued for the inclusion of breadth of shoulders, which they said indicates skeletal development, and breadth of the hips, which they said indicates pelvic development. The chest girth measurements were meant to measure pulmonary or thoracic play, a person's ability to inhale and exhale fresh air. And then this also included cranial measurements, which Gray said correlated to intellect. The instruments used would be sliding scale calipers for shoulders, calipers for the head, graduated standard with a sliding bar for height, and a weighing machine. And these are just some examples of the kinds of instruments they might have used if the survey actually happened. And some of these tools were actually designed by Gray and Cunningham themselves. The eighth and last measurement, degree of pigmentation, was meant to determine race. It would measure hair color and eye color with color scales, represented by 20 different hair samples and 20 different glass eyes. And these are some examples of the possible pigmentation schemes, categorization schemes that they may have used. Now, members of the Inter-departmental Committee largely accepted the measurements that were proposed, but they questioned this one because they thought that racial classifications were outside of the scope of what it was that they were trying to do. So Gray and Cunningham put forward two interlinked justifications, argued that it was scientifically and socially important to study relationships between race and physique in order, as they said, to maintain favorable racial characteristics in the population. Their second justification, which is what ultimately convinced the Inter-departmental Committee to include this, was that this data was needed to determine the national physical standard and to ensure that any deviations they measured were the result of environmentally caused deterioration, not to be confused with inherited racial differences. Gray emphasized this point to the committee. If we have measured a group of people who are brunette, very dark, and we compare them with a group of people having mostly blonde hair, we know that they belong to different races, and we would expect their normal or inherited average dimensions to be different. This remark generated a heated exchange between Gray and Colonel Onslow, a member of the Inter-departmental Committee, which brought into relief some of their contrasting ideas about British national belonging. Onslow said, "Do you think that the British Isles generally are so marked? Are not the races very much mixed up?" Gray responded, "I do not think so by any means." Onslow replied, have we each got the blood of several different races in us? Gray says, no doubt in many cases, but the rural population in many districts is of the same racial type as it was hundreds of years ago. The politics of exclusion and inclusion that underwrote hereditarian explanations of physique and which guided the formulation of the survey became even more apparent when Gray emphasized to the committee what he saw as an important cause of deterioration, the immigration of degenerate aliens, as he put it. He testified that it is self-evident that admixture of an inferior race with a superior race, even without intermarriage, will reduce the average national physique. But as long as the inferior race remains isolated, the evil can always be remedied in the last resort by the expulsion of degenerate aliens. If, however, the inferior race intermarries to any considerable extent with the native population, this remedy can no longer be applied, and the high position which the superior race has won by ages of progressive evolution may in a few generations be hopelessly lost. Now, the degenerate aliens that Gray had in mind were Jews in England and a growing community of Eastern European Jewish immigrants in particular, who he claimed were causing a local decline in physique. To support this claim, he drew upon a bunch of different evidence, the sources of which are a bit unclear, but he said, that the history of Poland is an awful example of national ruin brought about by the unrestricted immigration of degenerate aliens. About 600 years ago, the Jews were invited to settle in Poland at a time when they were cruelly persecuted in every other country in Europe. At that date, the Poles had the high average stature which the other races of Northern Europe still possess. Poland now contains the largest percentage of Jews and the lowest average stature in Northern Europe. And then from there, he argued that anthropometric tests should be required for immigration to the UK in order to preserve the national physique. So the Inter-departmental Committee actually reacted quite negatively to these claims. The chairman asserted that eugenic concerns about admixture of races was irrelevant to their inquiries. And while other committee members did not directly challenge Gray's racialization of Jews, they offered environmental counter-arguments and kind of counter-studies and counter-evidence. They argued, for example, that Jewish school children in London had recently demonstrated better academic performance and physical health than their peers. And one member went as far as to joke that if others adopted Jewish families' child-rearing practices, then perhaps the national physique would actually improve rather than decline. Another hereditarian example that Gray and Cunningham cited as a cause of physical deterioration was the immigration of people with favorable physiques. Singling out Ireland as an area of concern, Cunningham speculated that the country would have more physical deterioration than other countries of the UK. And he claimed that it was the young, the strong, and the enterprising members of the population that have gone. Gray offered a similar assessment by citing a 1903 study that tried to connect an increase in what they called at the time insanity in Ireland over the prior 50 years with an increase in emigration. He argued that this indicated that people with favorable physiques were leaving the country and causing degeneration among those left behind. Members of the Inter-departmental Committee were also skeptical of these claims and findings and studies, and they pointed out that an ostensible increase in insanity could also be the result of an ongoing expansion of the term's definition. And that while insanity had also increased in England, emigration had not. Another and final area in which the survey implicated questions of national belonging related actually quite directly to the question of who would be measured as part of the survey. Gray and Cunningham advocated for measuring the whole population or at least a representative sample. But the Inter-departmental Committee decided to only measure school children and child factory workers. They believed that it would be easier and less expensive to do that, and that it would be a useful way to familiarize the broader public with the survey and to earn their support. And beyond these practical concerns, this decision also aligned with the Inter-departmental Committee's environmental emphases on the importance of childhood development to adult fitness. So it elevated a view of children as sources of future national progress, and emphasized the potential for state interventions in children's living, learning, and working conditions to improve the national physique. So the proposed survey really kind of posited strong and healthy children who would grow up into strong and healthy adults as aspirational proxies for the nation as a whole. So what happened in the end? Ultimately, the survey gained very little traction in Parliament. Other research on this topic has suggested that part of this was because the Campbell-Bannerman government at the time, which was elected in 1905, was skeptical of large social programs. There were concerns that the survey would burden the working class and that it would be difficult to operationalize. In the meantime, Cunningham and Gray continued their work with the Anthropometric Committee at the BAAS, and they also lobbied Parliament to adopt the survey, but their campaign faded away when they died in 1909 and 1911, respectively. And then the start of World War I sidelined it indefinitely. However, the Inter-departmental Committee's focus on children actually influenced some other legislation. The 1907 Education Bill included anthropometric measurements and health inspections for school children, but the survey was never actually implemented as it was originally envisioned. Other proposals to measure citizens' bodies were rejected around the same period. In the years preceding the proposed survey, the British military considered, but ultimately refrained, from using anthropometrics and fingerprints to identify British soldiers. And as the historian Edward Higgs pointed out, policymakers feared that citizens would avoid military enlistment because of these systems, associations with criminality, colonialism, and societal exclusion, and that hostile attitudes toward immigrants at that time only augmented the racial dimensions of these associations. So the survey may have failed on similar grounds. While many factors contributed to its demise, I make the modest proposal that despite the Inter-departmental Committee's efforts to cast it in an environmental framework of social reform, the survey's overt associations with eugenics, hereditarian explanations for physique, and exclusionary politics of national belonging were crucial to its downfall. Though eugenics was an accepted part of science at the time, it was unpopular in British government and parliament. And in their discussions of the survey, members of parliament explicitly expressed their concerns that the survey and the Inter-departmental Committee's report overall blurred deterioration with eugenic notions of degeneracy. Government ministers and medical experts believed that the survey was not needed in order to pursue immediate action on matters like alcoholism, infant mortality, and the living and working conditions of urban working class neighborhoods, which they said existing public health knowledge already demonstrated the effects that these had on the human body. And while a national anthropometric survey was deemed unacceptable at the time, collection of other kinds of citizens' data became part of a number of other reforms in the period, such as the pension system in 1908 and the national insurance system in 1911. And meanwhile, the UK's first ever controls on immigration, the 1905 Aliens Act, was passed largely with the intention of curbing Eastern European Jewish immigration at that time. The National Anthropometric Survey was not only meant to acquire reliable data about the physical health of the people, it was also meant to address questions about national belonging and connected biometric measurements with questions of who exactly belonged in the nation. Its design was shaped by the Inter-departmental Committee's environmental approaches to national physique and concerns about deterioration, as well as the Anthropometric Committee's eugenic and hereditarian concerns about degeneration. In the process, their varying understandings of the national physique imbued the survey's methods with varying politics of inclusion and exclusion. Now, I want to conclude by offering a few possibilities for thinking about the relevance of the survey to contemporary states' uses of biometrics to identify their own citizens. I don't want to overstate the connections to these contemporary systems because they are quite different. National biometric identification systems today generally have the purpose of verifying individual identity rather than interpreting it in the way that the survey would have. But I also don't want to understate connections to the present. In contemporary national biometric systems, measurements still denote forms of national belonging, whether it is citizenship, residency, or access to government services and benefits. They also still require an answer to the question of who exactly is to be included in the system. And so the survey thus brings attention to the ways that even biometric systems aimed at whole populations can still contain politics of inclusion and exclusion. And one useful example for thinking about this could be the British Home Office's 2004 attempt, exactly 100 years after the proposed National Anthropometric Survey, to introduce a national biometric ID card and database for all British citizens and European Economic Area residents. Colloquially dubbed the National Identity Scheme, the system was formalized following Parliament's passage of the Identity Cards Act in 2006. Justifications for its introduction related to national security, government efficiency, preventing identity theft, controlling immigration, among other reasons, while opposition groups cited civil liberties and the system's cost and feasibility. They also connected it with a papers, please approach to citizens that invoked exclusionary connotations of oppressive governments, past colonial projects, and suspicion of minority communities and immigrants in the contemporaneous period. Ultimately, Parliament canceled the system following elections in 2010. And while, of course, this national identity scheme failed for a variety of reasons, but perhaps, like the 1904 survey, this was also due in part to the system's associations with exclusionary politics of, as the colloquial shorthand name for the system suggests and emphasizes, national identity. So in this talk, I mostly emphasize the survey's relevance to contemporary state uses of biometrics to identify their own citizens, but their insights can also inform our thinking about other kinds of biometric systems. It brings into relief the exclusionary dimensions of state systems that track non-citizens or systems that single out particular groups within society for surveillance and control. and that these are often explicitly justified by governments on the basis of security. The survey also illuminates the many ways biometric data can be used, interpreted, and given meaning. It reminds us that the very same measurements that can be used to verify individual identity are the same ones that could be used to interpret individual identity, such as by using biometrics to make inferences about gender, race, age, emotional and mental states, or even blood pressure. Historically, biometric systems were designed to do all of these things. So by paying close attention to the history of a nearly 120-year-old biometric system that never happened, I'm hoping that as I continue this work, we can be slightly better equipped to consider the significance and consequences of the ways biometric systems are designed, implemented, accepted, or rejected today and in the future. Thanks a lot, and I will look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for a terrific talk. We have some time for some Q&A now. Please go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. While we wait for that to happen, Michelle, I thought I'd ask you to maybe think about or comment on maybe a couple different topics that came to mind as I listened to your talk. And the first was, you mentioned that the original hook on which this effort was hung, so to speak, in 1904 was this finding that there was this fear that British population was not ready for military service. And this motivates, in your talk, the beginning of this project, but that seems to drop out very quickly. The civil servants and the politicians seem to be interested in improving health for other reasons. The Anthropological Society seems to be pursuing its own research agenda. What happens to that debate? And I think it's interesting. The reason I think I would connect it to today is similar surveys have come out in the United States. For example, in 2018, the Heritage Institute came up with a survey that like 71% of the U.S. population that would normally be eligible for military service, 17 to 30, I think, is also not physically ready for military service. So what happened to that national security motivation once the discussion started? And secondly, it might be interesting to try to connect this to, or something to think about, is a lot of the debates around biometrics and vaccination around COVID, and sort of the vaccine card and vaccine passports, and who's included and excluded in different kinds of events, who's allowed to participate or not, and whether there might be some echoes on the inclusion exclusion kind of argument around that. So two totally different things, but maybe pick one if you want, and if you want to comment on it or think about it, or if not, maybe take it for future research.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll speak to both of them, but maybe spend more time on one just to keep time for, yeah, so that's true. The kind of perceived necessity of doing a National Anthropometric Survey started from the military. So yeah, kind of in a slightly different way, but maybe not totally dissimilar. Like the creation of biometric systems starts with a sort of military, or like you said, kind of national security impetus. The thing that was very interesting was that the director of the Army Medical Service, who first wrote this memorandum, was very unhappy with how this issue ended up getting taken up by government. And he actually wrote some kind of displeased letters to the Inter-departmental Committee saying, listen, I never made any assertions about a decline in the national physique or physical deterioration in the population. I'm just saying that, the recruits are unfit, and I would really like it if you could just focus on that. So there was a perception, it seems, within the military that the government kind of took this and then ran with it in a direction that was completely irrelevant to them, which is kind of interesting, yeah. And yeah, like you mentioned, anthropometric studies do still happen in relation to the military today, questions about readiness and physical fitness. Recently with some of the folks at some other groups that I workshopped this paper with, we were talking about the president's physical fitness test. So like anyone who went to public high school in the United States up until, I don't know, maybe 2015, might be getting that date wrong, had to do all kinds of like running and other tests, which was exactly for this kind of reason. But also the US military still periodically conducts anthropometric surveys, a little bit more with a kind of ergonomic, it seems, purpose, like to design spaces and equipment to match the measurements of soldiers' bodies. Yeah, this would be a very interesting avenue for further research, to just also kind of see how uses of anthropometrics by the military to measure soldiers' bodies or potential recruits has sort of continued through time. And in regard to vaccine cards and vaccine passports, yes, of course. I mean, this case kind of reminds us, I think, about another area in which surveillance and techniques of tracking and identification and using the body for that purpose could also be put into the context of public health, right? Surveillance is a pretty key part of public health work, and particularly in the context of a pandemic. So yes, certainly any kind of form of identification will denote certain politics of inclusion and exclusion. Yes, also in the case with vaccine cards.
Right. Yeah. Just on the first one, I thought it's, I mean, there's any number of studies of things that have been problems that have been securitized to justify their importance. I just thought it was kind of interesting how it all got very quickly washed out in the story you told about the UK. It may be something having to do with the UK having a relatively actually small military compared to continental Europe, all volunteer at the time, not conscription as in the French or German models. But the other thing I was going to say about military ergonomics was uniforms. Look into uniforms because they come in a remarkable number of sizes, apparently. Anyway, going on to some questions from the audience, and be mindful of the time. The first question is from Austin Cooper. Does the survey's fate suggest that the implementation and acceptance of biometric technologies depends on how well their advocates can depoliticize and naturalize close state attention to citizens and residents' lives? Do biometric enthusiasts still appeal to health and fitness in order to legitimize their goals?
Yeah, I think my sense is that this is correct, or it might not necessarily be to depoliticize biometric technologies, but to align them with politics that are more societally and politically acceptable. So I don't know, it's hard to say. What if the survey was cast in a different framework? Would it have been accepted? Maybe. But it also kind of seems to me, and this is sort of the hunch that I'm working on here, is that measuring the body had very close associations with exclusion, with colonial projects, with policing, and that this was simply and with eugenics, of course, right? And that this was very unpalatable politically and societally. So even if it was cast in a sort of different rhetoric, I don't know that the biometrics themselves, like the measurements at hand, would have been different. Do biometric enthusiasts still appeal to health and fitness in order to legitimize their goals? Today, no. No, not really. When you see state national biometric systems, they appeal a lot more to factors of government that might rely on being able to identify individuals. They talk about the delivery of government services and benefits. They talk about government efficiency, about national progress, and then of course, national security, right? With this sort of element of being able to discern who's a citizen and who's not.
And I know we have a hard stop at 12:30, but I thought maybe we could take the first part of John Emery's question, which is looking at asking whether you could elaborate on the distinction between measuring a part of the population, such as children, in your case for aspirational reasons versus measuring the entire population. Is maybe just to add on to this, another example of sort of trying to legitimize or justify biometric identification by making it more palatable to the population. And maybe you could talk to the politics of that at the time that you're speaking of in 1904, early 20th century.
Could you say that again, Harold? Sorry, just
John was asking
what you added to the.
Oh, just whether you could connect that to the politics of making biometrics palatable, acceptable by connecting it to these aspirational goals. So think of the children, for example, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that I didn't speak too much about the children in the children aspect in this talk, but that is a really interesting area here where children at this time had been subjected to a lot of anthropometric measurement, that this was sort of a part of the population that it seemed to be kind of okay to measure them as part of medical inspections, but also on the part of eugenic research projects like John Gray himself and other members of the BAAS Anthropometric Committee were conducting anthropometric studies of school children. Part of that may have had to do with them just being a very accessible population, like children in schools, children working in factories were under the jurisdiction of the state to some degree or another. But I think, thinking about this example sort of makes very plain how, using children as a sort of proxy for thinking about the nation of the whole as a whole fit very much into the broader politics of the time. This idea that, children should be invested in, that they're kind of these national resources and sources of future strength, right? That investing in them now will bring national progress later. And it also kind of highlights the sort of imagined communities dimension to this, the ways in which biometric data and biometric systems like the National Anthropometric Survey are kind of sites of imagining the nation, or actually constituting the nation or the future of the nation. So I think that in terms of thinking about biometric systems that encompass whole populations today is sort of the main lesson here to carry over, that there is still a kind of imagining that goes on, or constituting that goes on of who is the nation, who is included. I hope I answered the question.
No, that was great. And I think we're at time. So please, everyone, joining me in welcoming CSEC and HAI predoctoral fellow, Michelle Spector, for a really terrific talk. And thank you for joining us today, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.